wimping out when it's decision time. That's a really technical group dynamics term. I'm sure you're all familiar with wimping out when it's decision time. But it turns out that some of the worst decisions that we make are actually non-decisions. They're when we don't actively make a choice. I think sometimes we feel like if we don't make a choice, we're limiting our risk, right? How can we go wrong if we're not going to go out on the limb and actually choose something? But of course, not choosing an action is making a choice, right? It tends to lean towards what we call the status quo. If we don't make a decision, the status quo, what is right now, the current situation, continues. And so we've essentially made a decision to invest in the status quo. And when I think about these different ways that we do that, I realize that the reason that we wimp out is because we have a problem with two different things, really. We have a problem with commitment, first of all. That may be hard to hear if you say, well, we have trouble committing to something. But maybe it's easier to understand if you understand it in terms of options and keeping your options open. I really discovered this, especially with the undergrads that I worked with. I think there are some generational differences when it comes to this, but I don't think anybody can really escape this idea. And that is that we don't like to think of ourselves as being unable to commit. That's a negative thing. But often we have an instinctive desire to keep our options open. Does that make sense? To make sure that you don't limit your options. If you had, let's say, 3 different options for something, they're like doors that you can open. There are many times that we don't really think of it as an inability to commit, but we really are instinctively trying to make sure that we don't limit the directions we can go. So if we're going to choose one particular option, sometimes it's difficult for us to recognize that means that we actually have to close the doors in the other direction. I mean, isn't that what committing is really all about? In a strange way, committing to a direction is to close your other options. And if you're in a serious relationship with someone, most of us in this room are married, I realized that when I chose to commit to my wife, I closed the door on any other options, right? It wasn't like, well, I want to manage things here. Yes, I'd like to marry you, but would you mind if I also kept seeing a few other people just in case, right? That's ludicrous to even hear because, of course, that's not any commitment at all. But for some reason, this coexists in us. We can simultaneously feel like we're ready to make a commitment and that we're able to make commitments, and yet in our practice, we spend all of our time trying to keep our options open. Just recognize that if you're going to be making a decision, when you get down to decision time, when it's really that moment to make a choice, it's a moment for committing. And you're likely to feel a twinge because in that moment of committing, you will turn off the other options. You won't be able to back up. You won't have plan B or plan C. You will commit to plan A, right? Now, commitment is one of the main problems on that, but the other challenge that we have is complexity. Complexity. You know, life is just not simple. And when we are trying to manage it that way, we get ourselves in trouble. Complexity causes us problems. It can cause us to double down on the status quo, if you will. What I mean by that is when things get too complicated, our instinct is often to step back and not decide. Instead, to just let things continue the way they are. If you want a little background from this, let me show you a piece of social psych research that kind of drives this point home. I call it complexity and the stickiness of the status quo because sometimes it's hard to release ourselves from what is and turn our attention to what we want to become because what is just so sticky. It's hard for us to let go. They ran this experiment to demonstrate this. They showed x-rays like this to a number of surgeons, a number of doctors, and had them review this file and decide what the best course of action would be for the person that they were showing these x-rays to. So let me show you a little bit about what happened here. When they showed it to the doctor, they looked at the x-rays and they decided, you know, this is very clearly a situation where this person needs a hip replacement. Now, this is a big invasive surgery, right, with a lot of time and recovery. And they said that's really what's necessary. And they made plans to do this. They scheduled the surgery. They booked it all, and everything was moving forward in this. Then the researchers came back and they said, well, we appreciate you reviewing this and making this decision, but we're sorry there was a mistake in the file. It turns out that another treatment had not been explored first, and that was simply the use of large doses of an anti-inflammatory, ibuprofen. And they said, we're sorry, that hasn't been tried yet. Are you sure you want to go on with the surgery? So you realize the surgeons were actually suddenly confronted with this choice. What would they do? So let me ask you, if you were that doctor and you'd reviewed the file, you recognized that it was time for a hip replacement and you had scheduled it, you were headed in this direction, that's the status quo, if you will, the plan. But then you discover that there is another option, another alternative that hadn't been tried yet. What would you do? Yeah, that would make sense, right? Well, for that reason, when they did this, the majority of the doctors, when they were appraised of this fact, changed the plan and said, okay, wait, let's put that on hold. Let's try the medication, the least invasive, before we go on and do this big thing, the hip replacement. That makes sense, right? That should be reassuring to all of us that our doctors are thinking about these things. But remember, this is an example of how complexity actually affects our ability to make a choice or to move away from the status quo. So they actually ran this twice. What I just described to you was the first group, the first iteration of it. Then they ran it again, and in this situation, they did the same thing. They showed the doctors the file, and they came to the same conclusion that a hip replacement was necessary. And then they came back to those doctors, and they said, same thing they said to the first group, we didn't realize there was a less invasive procedure that hadn't been taken care of. It was the ibuprofen. So they said that. And then they also said to this group, and there is another medication, another course of treatment as well that hadn't been tried. Now, if you were a doctor in this second group, what do you think you would choose to do? You're waving these around? Well, you may already know where this is going. Look at this. Yeah, in this case, 72% of them continued with the plan to go to surgery. Now you realize what we're demonstrating here. We're demonstrating that, look, when things get complicated, it causes us to lean back and not make a decision to change. And we can understand that principle, but maybe the more important question is, okay, but how much more complicated does it need to get before the status quo gets so sticky? Well, in this place, just one more option. Now, I don't know, this may make you worried about the next time you go to your doctor, right? You're thinking about that. But pause for a moment and audit your experiences where complexity is concerned, the meetings you've been in, the discussions you've been in. When things get too complicated, or when we lack the tools to simplify them, does it cause you to double down on the status quo? Does it cause you to fail to make a decision, or to wimp out, or maybe simply put the decision off? These are all the experiences when we allow complexity to sneak in and drive our decision making. In fact, it can cause us to wimp out when it's decision time. Let me add just another little piece to this as you're thinking about that. When we talk about complexity, really, I think it's important to unpack the way we think of it, because we often think of, maybe we think of hard decisions, right? We've all faced hard decisions. But I think that we mean a couple different things by that. On one hand, when we face a hard decision, we may think of it as being a very complicated situation, right? You can hear yourself saying that, wow, this is just a hard decision, meaning that there's a lot of moving parts and those sorts of things. Or sometimes we use that phrase to denote something that's hard because it's difficult. The decision is going to require us to do something that's difficult, that's challenging for us personally to walk this path and to execute it. Now, these are important to know the difference of in your interactions, because look, when something's complicated, that usually means that we need more time and we need more info, right? Let's take our time, let's think more, let's get some more information. We need to make this more simple, more easy for us to understand so that we can make a good decision. But when things are difficult, we don't need more time, we simply need more courage. Now, this is the reason I'm driving this point home, because I've been in many meetings where I've been listening to the sorts of things and I start thinking, wow, this is really hard. What we're talking about and the potential solution that we're coming up with, the decision that we're about to make is really hard. And if I inadvertently think of that in terms of it's complicated, I start drawing back from making a decision. It may be decision time, but I'm reticent to make a decision right now. I think, well, the wise thing would be to seek some more information. Or maybe the wise thing would be just to wait a little longer. Maybe if I wait a little longer, it'll get simpler or it'll get more clear to me. And I'm acting as if it's complicated, when in reality, it's just difficult. It means I'm going to have a really difficult conversation with someone following this meeting. I don't need more information. I need more courage, right? It's going to mean that I have to close off my other options, square my shoulders, and step into plan A. I don't need more time and information. I need more courage, right? Now, the reason I just want to make this apparent is if we want to make good decisions, we have to avoid wimping out when it's decision time. And when we realize that it's decision time, we have to recognize that it may be difficult, but no amount of time is going to boost our courage. Now's the time to support one another, to pray about it, to reflect again on our role or what's at stake and how we're serving not only the ministry, but perhaps God himself, and to just kind of square our shoulders and say, it's time to make a decision, rather than to put it off. Does this make sense? All right, so I want to give you just a couple moments here. As we talk through the next couple iterations of the seminar here, I'm going to have some specific tools that you're working with. But in this moment, I just want to encourage you to audit some of the decisions that are at hand now. Maybe you're in the middle of some of them at this point in some conversation in a team, maybe with the people that you lead. And I'd like you to audit it for two things. Number one, is it decision time? Is this the time where it's called upon you to make a choice, to separate yourself from the other options? And rather than generating alternatives, is this the time to decide which one is the right one and turn away from the others? And if it is decision time, is it a moment where you need courage rather than more information? So take just a moment on your notes there and make a couple notes to yourself about some of the decisions you may be facing now so that you at least know where you're turning and you don't run the risk of wimping out when it's actually decision time. Let me pause here and just ask, as you think about this, I know it's not fire from the mountain or some complicated idea, but it does draw your attention in a different direction. As you've reflected for a moment, even on your own experience, you come to any realizations? Anything you've noticed or anything you'd like to share on this topic that others might take to heart? Yeah, well, you need to seek counsel, especially when you need a coalition to help move something that's been stuck or that hasn't happened for years. And in fact, when a decision does not get made over time, it doesn't get easier to make the next time, does it? Just sort of gets dug in a little deeper and a little harder to make that decision. If anything, it takes more courage now to diverge from the status quo, because the status quo has been carved even deeper into the experience. And so in those moments, you find that even if you seek counsel and you understand a direction to go, more than ever, it comes down to the courage to step forward when iterations previously did not. Right? Yeah. Sometimes there's courage in numbers too. Right? When you're not going it alone. Any other thoughts? Well, take that to heart in terms of when you're in a meeting, maybe you need to be the one to say, I think this is a moment for courage rather than more information. I think it's a moment where we need to prayerfully and carefully consider our options, but then have the courage to square our shoulders and close the doors to other options so that we can advance.